Hi there. This is Maggie Harrison from the Women's and Gender Studies Department at City College of San Francisco. I'm here in conversation with Dr. Mauro Osborne Cifuentes, the instructor of the Introduction to Masculinity Studies class we're offering in fall 2020. And we've come back to answer the questions that remained from our webinar on discussing the class and the Mask You Live In documentary. So hi, Mauro.
Hi, Maggie. How you doing?
Very good. So I'm just going to dive straight into the questions from the participants. So one of our counselors asked, do you expect to include projects or hands-on assignments in this course?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good question because I think when people sign up for classes, they also kind of want to have a sense of, what is the assignment structure or the workload going to look like? And, I'm going to obviously interpret this sort of in my own way, because projects and hands-on assignments might mean different things to different people. How I think of this is, are the assignments that I'm doing for this class going to be, sort of building up to something larger, right? And also, am I going to have the opportunity to kind of think through these assignments with other people and how they are both shaped by my own experiences in the world? And am I also going to be able to leave this class with tools to take the ideas from the class and share them with others? So that's kind of how I'm interpreting that question. So my apologies if that isn't how the questioner intended it. But the simple answer is yes. So my idea for how the assignments will look is that all the assignments are going to be connected in some way to a larger project or a larger vision that students are going to be working towards, sort of starting with themselves and their own interest in the class as the point of entry, and then sort of doing some thinking and reflecting through a little bit of research, through the class readings and discussions, but also in conversation with peers or potentially through a service learning project, right? That students will be able to think about a topic or an issue that is important to them and kind of lean into it more deeply. And hopefully through the course of the semester, through conversations with others, through ongoing learning, be able to come out of the class with either some more information, some more tools, or some project ideas for things to pursue beyond the scope of the class. So that's kind of my short and long answer for that. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. That sounds good. It's good to know what to expect.
Yeah.
Okay. This next question is from a student in our community who says, I'm not sure how to put this into a question, but I spend a lot of time thinking about it and how our medical and social society focuses so much on genitals and how they should dominate who we are. How can we be ourselves and not let those ideas define us while honoring our bodies? And they add in parentheses, this specifically comes from an ongoing conversation I'm having with someone. The student is curious to unpack it more in class with a decolonial perspective. And if you have thoughts about that now and how to do that, please share them.
Yeah, there's like 4 or 5 questions in this question. So I'm going to try to go through all the different parts of it. But, before I do that, I do think that this is something that we're probably going to have to unpack in class, like pretty early on in the conversation, because these are a lot of understandings that people bring into these conversations. And I also anticipate that people are going to be bringing in lots of questions that are coming up for them through discussions that they're having or have had with other people or want to have with folks in their lives, to kind of open up broader space to think with people around them about these questions of, gender and masculinity and body. So I think that stuff like this is perfectly relevant to this class. And so this question of how can we be ourselves, right? I think that's probably the hardest question to answer, but that's the one that maybe I'll start with. And I think how we be ourselves is through the support of other people who kind of allow us to be ourselves in all the kinds of fluid and dynamic ways that can and should look across a lifetime. I think we often have these ideas that, people come into themselves, in a certain phase, like by adolescence, you kind of like become this fully baked version of who you're going to be for the rest of your life. And what I've found, from having friends across, generations and age spectrums is that, yeah, that's something that's an ongoing life practice, but it requires other people, which is kind of different than how we often hear that talked about, where you're just supposed to kind of like dig within yourself and figure out who the core truth of you is. But in reality, that's not really how people come into themselves. They come into themselves through relationships with other people and communities. So yeah, that's just one thing that I would just kind of say to frame my response to the rest of, you know, how I'm going to answer the pieces of this question. But yeah, you know, how can we be ourselves and honor our bodies without letting these ideas of sort of like, you know, body parts defining who we are and telling the whole rest of the story of our lives. So I do a lot of teaching in schools and nonprofits around how we can start to break up this cascade of assumptions that starts to come into play when, you know, a little person is born and we look at their body parts, and based on whether or not they have, you know, what we think is a penis or a vulva, we then start to tell these entire stories about, you know, who they're going to be, how they're going to identify, how gender is going to live in their life, what kinds of relationships they want to have, who they want to have those relationships with, what roles they want to take in those relationships, how they want to be or don't want to be sexual within those relationships. So just based off some small body parts, we start to tell these really intricate stories about people's lives, right? A fancy phrase for that is what we call biological determinism, right? Biological is basically the idea that there's a science of bodies, and a lot of that is based around genitals. And then determinism is just the idea that we can tell the whole rest of the story about something based on its very beginnings, right? Those are kind of, you know, falsehoods, but they play out a whole bunch, you know, in our culture. And so I think that yeah, that's something we can definitely unpack. And I think what's really interesting about this conversation about what I'm calling biological determinism of bodies is the idea that so much of the science of sort of like the evolution of people through the human lifespan was really developed in colonial contexts across the world. So this hierarchy of sort of like baby to adult was sort of developed in the concept or in the conceptual space of colonization, where colonial scientists were figuring out like, okay, who are the lowest evolved humans and who are the highest evolved humans? And so, you know, you can kind of graft those two, you know, trajectories of development onto one another throughout the human lifespan, but also throughout this kind of like racial evolutionary lifespan. And so the relationship between children and colonized folks is one that's really tangled kind of in the colonial scientific archive. And early on in the class, that's just going to be something we're going to have to name. You know, obviously we won't be able to go as in depth into that as one could if we were sort of focusing on sort of like colonial science or colonial histories, but it will be an important grounding framework for understanding, you know, these conversations about gender and bodies and yeah, masculinity. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. There's so much more that could be said about that, but that's kind of the shortest answer I can give to answer that question with the respect it deserves.
That's great. Thank you. I think it's really what I like about that, the way you just described that, is how you framed this as this introductory class, right? This is an introduction to masculinity studies, and so part of what students will get is this view of what would happen if they went on to earn a degree or a graduate program. Like certainly the decolonial connections would be a ground for that. And so you've given us a window into what sort of the basic groundwork is, and then also how the study would grow and develop. That sounds great.
Every week people are going to be asking questions, and we're going to be having discussions that could become undergraduate honors theses, that could become master's theses, that could become community projects, right? That could become, you know, personally transformative frameworks for talking with families and friends, you know? So it's like every week we're going to be throwing out stuff that people are going to be able to run with if they want to. So
exciting. Okay, next question. Is this course going to explore the white young male as a mass murderer? I don't understand it, but it seems to be the case. And I'd like to understand why it's happening and what we can do to turn that around.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And again, I think I love questions that have on the surface the appearance of a singular question, but really have like 4 or 5 questions tucked into them. That's kind of how I ask questions. So I really appreciate when that pops up. So yes, I mean, this course is, you know, of necessity going to have to engage with some of the forms of violence from men or masculine people that are weighing most heavily on our minds. And I think even though, you know, we're doing sort of, you know, recruitment and registration for this course in the time of the coronavirus, you know, there are lots of things that were really, really pressing topics. And I think one thing that's really interesting during this moment is that, you know, because of quarantine, you know, they have still happened, but mass shootings have gone down. Seriously. Now, is it happening because, you know, people are sitting quietly in their home and sort of reflecting on their own wounds and psyches? Not necessarily. I think it's because people aren't gathering in large places, and so there aren't those same opportunities. And so that's kind of an important thing to think through for me. You know, why is it that the only way we can stop these things from happening is if people aren't gathering in large places? To me, that's sort of a problematic solution to a problem. So I'm glad that there aren't mass shootings that are happening nearly as much right now. And at the same time, I think that when people are coming out of shelter in place, that I think these issues are going to bubble back up again. And hopefully that is happening to some degree during the time of this class. But what I will say really briefly is that my understanding of this is that, you know, from conversations I've had, from reading and research I've done, from my own observations of these sort of topics as they exist in popular culture, is that, you know, the expectations that are placed on young white males to be a part of that group of people that is supposed to have the inherent capacity to rise up and dominate society, right? When you're raised with that narrative and that expectation of yourself, that is a really easy and high pedestal to fall from.
Yeah.
So from that experience, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of frustration, there are a lot of feelings of anxiety and inadequacy. And that's a recipe for violent disaster. You know, instead of often what happens, you know, is that these are in many ways, you know, young people playing out that pain in a massified way. People don't like to be alone in their pain. And, you know, when you take that pain and you distribute it out to other people, it's a really problematic way to get your feelings responded to. And we know that, you know, reaching out for support is not something that young white males are told they should do, let alone, you know, lots of other groups. You know, so you take a group of people, you put the pressure to dominate the world on them, you take away their ability to reach out for support when they're experiencing emotional turmoil, and you put a lot of privilege into them as well. So there's this kind of like aggrieved and resentful sense towards other people when they don't reach the height of that pedestal. And, you know, I think when I break it down that way, it can become really easy to see why young white males are often the ones, you know, committing these horrific acts of violence. And that's going to be something that we're going to have to talk about and find ways to talk about that, you know, respect all of the different perspectives in a class, but really just kind of try to break that down in a way that is both like holding people to account, but also humanizing of the people who are committing that violence.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is from one of our community. As you know, we work closely with San Francisco Unified School District, and some of our and we offer Project Survive classes in the high schools as well. So this question is, how can we increase the participation of boys in high school wellness center programs? wellness centers tend to mostly draw girls and tend to be run by women. And I'll just note as an entry into this is that we have a partnership with the wellness programs. And so we definitely get students who are participants in the wellness centers who come and earn a sexual health educator certificate. And we're very well aligned with that. So yeah, that's the broader context. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. This is something I think about all the time. You know, I've run, you know, similar types of programming as stuff to what occurs in the wellness centers. And it's sort of like the perpetual problem of running programs that are focused on health, that are focused on social emotional learning, that are focused on, you know, community wellness, is that those are all things to care about that expectations of masculinity seriously discourage. You know, taking care of one's health means recognizing when you have pain or discomfort, right? If folks watch The Mask You Live In, you know that that's stuff that, you know, young boys, men, masculine people are discouraged from recognizing, right? So you have to have the capacity and the freedom to be able to recognize your own needs, pain, and discomfort, and to directly address that. It's a really challenging thing for people to do when they're told to toughen up, you know, to seem stoic, to not show pain or upset. That's a tricky thing. I think another part of this question is, you know, the fact that, you know, who runs a thing often shapes who shows up for that thing. And, you know, work in public schools, at least the on the ground work within the schools has been, I don't want to use the word dominated by women because I think that gives I don't think that's an accurate way to describe how school institutions work. I would say schools have tended to be more populated by women professionals or people who appear to us as women or feminine folks, because that has been really devalued and denigrated, kind of like caregiving labor with young people, right? And so, you know, wages have been suppressed, prestige is suppressed, training is not valued, support is not valued, and they're really stressful jobs. They're a lot of work. And so that's another piece of it is I think, you know, more broadly, you know, the more we can value, you know, the robust support of both children and young people, but also, you know, women and feminized labor, right? Like caring for young people, the more we're going to be able to create, you know, more resources, right? And with more resources, I think will come lots of diverse genders being more interested in that work. I think that's a problematic way to think about it, having just said that, because I think it means that people need to see themselves represented in something before they'll access it. And so I think that, you know, my answer makes it seem like I'm trying to get away from actually how do we address this right now in the here and now. And I think that's a really tricky question. I do think that, you know, emphasizing that wellness centers are places for boys, young men, masculine people, I think saying that, I think when people do informational sessions in this, I work for San Francisco Unified. So I think sometimes when we do informational sessions, we assume that when we speak in broad terms or like non-gendered terms, that universalizes it. And so everyone will see themselves in it. I think we did that because for a long time, we've talked about things culturally, like in masculinist terms, right? If you go back and read old books and old texts, they don't use gender neutral language. They think they're using universal language, but it's all he, him, his when we're talking about this like abstract third person. So our pendulum swing now has been to use gender neutral language for everything. But with things like wellness centers and health programming, if we're not explicitly saying like, young boys, young men, masculine people, we're talking to you too, they now write themselves out of that pitch, you know? And so I think inclusive language doesn't doesn't mean like broad universalizing gender neutral language. It means talking more specifically about what programming exists for each of the different groups of people. So, you know, in wellness centers, that'll mean talking about young women's groups, young men's groups, LGBTQ groups. You know, I think just sort of making sure that students are very clear about what support exists specifically for them. So that's one thing that I would say about that, is just being really specific about the programs that exist and having specific programming for the young groups that you're trying to target.
Excellent. Thank you,
Not an
Mauro.
easy answer.
That's great, though.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have one more question from our community. So to close it off, do you think that your class will explore how the concepts of feminism can intersect with positive concepts of masculinity?
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting about this class is, on the one hand, I can assume that many of the students who will be interested in this class have taken, intro to women and gender studies, which is taught with a feminist lens. I think there will also be lots of other people who have not taken that and will have not had that grounding because it's not a prerequisite for this class, and that's perfectly fine. So one of the things that is going to happen is, because everything I do and teach comes from the intention to fully infuse it with a feminist perspective, is that if you haven't taken Intro to Women and Gender Studies, you're gonna kind of get that in the course of this class, because that's how I teach. So all of the ways that we approach these conversations will be through that feminist lens. So it may not appear to you as explicitly as it would in, like, an intro to gender, women's, feminist studies kind of class, but it's going to be woven into everything that we do and will be made explicit in many, many moments. So, what is that going to look like? I mean, I think some of how I've been talking about these things, just in answering these questions, is a feminist perspective. When I say masculinity, I'm already not assuming that people assigned male at birth are the only people we're talking about, right? I'm talking about, lesbian, bisexual, queer women. I'm talking about non-binary and trans people. I'm already talking about a much broader category of people than what often gets assumed when we say masculinity, right? So just starting from there alone, that's sort of one example of how I'm already walking into this class. And I'm doing that, number one, because of, the communities I come from the life experience I have, but also, from the ethical commitments to all the people who are showing up saying that they're interested in this topic from their own lives and their own experiences. So, these concepts of feminism, these concepts of masculinity, because they already live in the world in multiple ways, we have to engage that multiplicity in the class. And I think feminism is a really helpful lens for us to look at masculinity through, because it already asks us to look at masculinity as this complex and multiple thing. So that's kind of, that's my answer to that one. Do you think that gets it that well enough, Maggie?
I think it does. I think it absolutely does. I mean, it's a broad question, and certainly, I mean, feminist masculinity is within the description of the course. Yeah. So it really it's very, very inclusive. And so yeah, I think you covered that. Okay, well, so that's a wrap. So thank you, cool, Mauro, for your additional time here, and thank you to the community for showing up and asking such great questions in the webinar. And we're really looking forward to the class that will start in August. The news has come out that we won't be holding classes in person. So this is going to be a virtual a virtual class, right? So it's going to be an online class that is accessible to everyone, and you can register right now. It's open at the City College registration site, and so we hope you'll rush over and register for Women's and Gender Studies 35 right now. Okay, thank you, Mauro. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.